When you think about this pied-à-terre tax, what do you think the impact would be on the economy of New York City?
Well, let's just start with the fact, and thank you for having me this morning to talk about this, that we're leaving a lot of money on the table in New York City. These are individuals who don't make New York City their primary residence and therefore don't pay income taxes. And that's money that's left on the table for things like our subway system, for things like affordable housing, for things like the infrastructure of our city that makes it what it is. So the New York City Comptroller has estimated that amount at $650 million a year that could go toward that important infrastructure.
Senator, but just to put a fine point on that statistic, it's a static statistic, as if nothing changed in terms of the tax itself changing the economics or interest in buying second homes in New York City. So the reason I mention that is it's very possible that people would look at this additional cost and say, you know what, I don't want to buy that second home, right?
Well, let's look at the fact that if you're purchasing a $6 million second home, you're only paying about $5,000 a year additional in this new tax. So that's not a lot of money. And we're talking about, in many instances, the global super rich who are looking to New York City as a security deposit in which to keep their money. They should pay a premium, frankly, on our laws, our system of infrastructure, our police and our fire. They need to pay for that in order to keep their money safe. And that's really, in part, what this tax is about.
Senator, I have questions about how this is going to be implemented, because, first of all, you have to prove that it's somebody not their primary residence, which, you know, has all sorts of issues, not just for those elite foreigners that you talk to, but a lot of people that own an apartment and then also own one for their parents or their kids in New York City. The second question is, how do you deal with the valuation question, where there's going to be all kinds of people gaming the system to try to get under that $5 million mark or get under each of those thresholds where the tax kicks in at a higher rate. So what will you use to value the apartments for this tax? Because most people don't get their homes appraised every single year.
Well, we're going to use a fair market value. It's something that the Department of Financial Services here in the state of New York is well equipped to assess. And when it comes to determining whether an apartment is an individual's primary residence, we have a formula through our STAR rebate program that is very equipped to assess whether someone spends 6 months or more as a resident of New York City. You also look at things like, whether they're registered to vote, where they get their mail, and et cetera.
But that's a huge new bureaucracy that you'll have to set up to implement this tax. That's going to reduce what you get from the tax, right?
I think we're already have that bureaucracy established because, as you know, keeping residents in New York City is sometimes, and for some people, an actual part-time job. So New York City, the state of New York, is established in determining whether someone is a resident or not. And in terms of the burden on the individual to whom this tax is directed, well, maybe they should just become residents of New York City, Senator, and pay income tax like the rest of us and keep our subways moving.
Senator, the separate question, though, goes to this, and Robert and I were talking about it earlier during the commercial break. There is a view among those in the real estate industry, and I don't think it's a wrong view, that by default, not only will the prices of these very expensive homes come down, but that it should trickle down in terms of pricing on homes under the $5 million mark. Do you agree with that? And when you talk about the burden on New York City or New York State taxpayers, it seems to me that if prices come down, that will affect any homeowner. No?
Well, I think there are larger forces at work, of course, in the real estate market. And, one always has to be aware of that. But I believe that this additional tax, which is in place in other world cities, is reasonable. It is applied in a progressive manner. And it's fair because at the end of the day, hardworking New Yorkers are paying income tax. And the global super elite who have second homes in New York are not. So they have to pay their fair share.
But Senator,
and we need to make certain that
Senator,
that is a message that's loud and clear across this country.
You've seen high tax states, right? Illinois, Connecticut, other places. And you've seen this same thing done. We're going to do it this way. There's people who are rich. We're going to get more money from them. Invariably, they move. Then you don't get their money, and then you actually have less than what you started with. I know you've seen this happen. Do you really not think that that's going to repeat itself here and that there's going to be a flight? You think Ken Griffin's not selling his place when it's $9 million more? You don't think all these other people are going to go down to Florida and have they have a choice? I know you love New York City. You live there. You think it's great. But they're going to move. Can't you add 2 and 2 together and see what the unintended consequences of this is going to be?
There are always consequences to public policy, and as a responsible legislator,
hopefully you don't do things that are
we have to moderate and understand what those are. But we're talking about real estate that is valued at $5 million more. We're talking about really a handful of people. 5,000 people is the estimate who are going to be impacted by this tax.
That you don't
and we're
need
also,
in New York,
we're also, sir, we're also looking at foreign nationals who purchase property, Russian, Chinese, Saudis, who purchase property in New York for the very reason that they're using these apartments as security deposits in the sky. This is a real estate proposition that should have a premium on it.
Senator, you make a good point that other cities in the world have done this, but those cities that have, you look at London, you look at Paris, you look at Sydney, all of those real estate markets fell after this tax. Now, there could be other reasons for that, for instance, Brexit in London, but you have to look at that example and say, isn't that going to happen in New York City? Don't you recognize that prices, at least in the short term, if this passes, are going to decline?
Well, I do understand that there are global trends in the real estate market, but I also understand that New York City needs to fund its subway system, its affordable housing, and make certain that the infrastructure that makes our city so attractive to foreign nationals who purchase second homes in New York continues to thrive. And that's really, at the end of the day, what we're trying to accomplish here.
See, too bad you don't have that $30 billion from Amazon anymore to help fund all those things.
Well, you know, Amazon is welcome to reestablish its second headquarters in the city of New York. They should understand that they have to go through a public review process like every other company that wishes to put
Senator,
up stakes
one of the
in
things
our
that
great city.
you know, I have very mixed views of this situation, I have to admit, and I didn't have a mixed view of the Amazon situation. You know, we all have this idea, especially of those of us who live in New York and New York City, that we think that this is such an attractive place to live that therefore people are just going to flock here no matter what. And one of the things that I learned in the process, actually, of looking at the Amazon situation is it just so happens that New York State happens to be the largest grantor in the entire country of incentives for corporations to be here. It's a remarkable thing. And so when you start to think about stripping away those incentives, and there's a big conversation going on in the city about that, when you start to think about adding taxes on top of different real estate proposals and things like that, I do have a real question. I think it's a legitimate one about whether you think that this city, just by default, is will be as attractive as it was yesterday.
Here's the deal. If we don't fix our subway system and allow middle-class New Yorkers to get to work on time, to pick up their kids, to go to the doctor, the city's going to come to a screeching halt.
I don't disagree with that.
Forget about your multi-million-dollar condominiums in the sky. We need to look underground and repair what's beneath our feet. And that's really what we're trying to do up here in this legislative session during this budget process that's really we're about to go into the deep discussions on this issue.
Senator, do you think there's a larger conversation to be had about how the tax base is distributed in the state of New York? I don't want to get into local politics, but when you really think about where taxes are generated and how they are spent in the state, I could make the argument as a resident of New York City that they are remarkably misallocated.
I don't disagree with you in terms of the progressive nature, particularly when it comes to real estate. You know, real estate is benefited by the fact that apartments are assessed on rentals, not on condominiums or co-ops. So we have a assessment system that values a multi-million-dollar apartment at pennies on the dollar because it's being assessed based on the rent-stabilized apartment that might be down the block. That's one of the reasons why we need this pied-à-terre tax to right the
I don't
system
disagree that that's a
here
problem.
in
What I'm suggesting
property
is
taxes.
the amount of revenue that's generated out of New York City and how much of that revenue is ultimately distributed over the state of New York relative to how it's spent, for example, on things like subways and the other infrastructure.
I'm sorry, say that again?
I was referring specifically to how how the revenue that's generated out of New York City, which is overwhelming relative to the rest of the state, is therefore then distributed throughout the state and does not come back to New York City in any reasonable way. And so when you talk about subways and you talk about other infrastructure, that's part of the problem.
That's a great point. And the Republicans in the state Senate who controlled it for the better part of 100 years took, more than half of every dollar that New York City sent to Albany and, sent it to other places throughout the state. We are the economic engine for the entire region. That's why we need a good subway system. That's why we need affordable housing. That's why we need to continue to attract talent across the world. And if we don't have that infrastructure in place, we're not going to do it.